walking and waiting with the Lord. And David said in Psalms 27, he kind of summed it up that David said he was confident of this, that the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, and he would see it. David said in Psalms 27, wait for the Lord, be strong, take heart, and wait for the Lord. David was confident that if he waited on the Lord, that the Lord would bring his goodness to him. And we also talked about last week that as we read the Bible, it's important that we don't allow, as we read the story, to flow from one intervention of God to the next, blessing or miracle, because there's a time span that's happened in between one blessing to the other as we read the story. Sometimes it's weeks, months, or years before God answers. But sometimes we have to deal with the silence of God as we face adversity in our lives. And so even though Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, he was enslaved and he carried himself with integrity as he went about his duties as a slave, as a prisoner, making everybody he came in contact with take notice of him. And they actually showed him favor as a result of that. So as he was waiting on the Lord was with him. And Joseph served in everything he did, always keeping his faith in the Lord. So just like Joseph, we have to trust God as we wait upon him. Joseph remained faithful to the Lord remained faithful to him. After 13 years of Joseph being enslaved in prison, he held on to his faith. He was always relying on God to lead and guide him. So we know that Joseph waited and waited until the Lord freed him. So Joseph had to look back on his life, the life storms that he went through, and we know he went through quite a few. But as he looked back, Joseph had to place the proper perspective on his life. And he told his brothers, he says, but as for you, you meant evil against me when you put me in that pit. You meant it for evil. You were trying to kill me. You sold me into slavery. But God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is in this day to save many people's lives. So David looked back and said, I can see now that storm I went through, God had purpose. God had a reason for it. And just like Joseph, we got to do the same thing. We have to look back on our lives and realize what God has brought us through as we look at today. So God may have been silent for 13 years in Joseph's life, but he was not still. He was working on his behalf. And as we wait on the Lord, it's not a passive activity. We must continue to live in faith, trusting him, working for him, regardless of what's going on in our life. We have to exercise some patience as we wait for the Lord. So Joseph spent 13 years facing one adversity after another at the hands of someone else's sin. He was subject to other people's sin that was responsible for that 13 years of his life, that he had some serious trials and tribulations. So we see how he handled himself, how he walked and waited upon the Lord as he was subjected to other people's sins, how he maintained his faith in the Lord. But he had to bear the sins of his brothers. He had to bear the sins of the Midianites, Potiphar's wife, the king's cupbearer. He was subject to and he dealt with the effects it had on him, holding on to his faith. So how do you walk with God through the sins of a country in a land that enslaves you? Now, as I said, Joseph spent 13 years dealing with the effects of other people's sin on him. And Joseph was innocent throughout his 13 years. But we know that in a land that enslaves you, as his descendants will be subjected to, living in the sins of others, how can you escape? Is there any rescue when you walk in the sins of a country? So we're going to take a look at Israel is they were enslaved as a people in a foreign land, subject to Pharaoh, ruler of the land. We're going to take a look at that today. But over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to look to draw some analogies and point out some differences between the plight of Israel living in slavery, bondage, and then their post-slavery life. And then we're going to take a look at African Americans living in slavery and its effects on post-slavery life in this country. I'm sorry, I went on mute. Sorry about that. But we're gonna look at African Americans living in slavery, and we know that happened 400 years ago. And then the effect on the post-slavery life in this country. And of course, we're living in post-slavery life right now. What does God expect of us? What did he expect of Israel? And we're going to take a look at both those situations. How does one maintain their walk with God in these situations? And what does God expect of people in these environments? So let's take a look at Israel and the Israelites. How did they get in that situation? And we know that God had told Abraham about his plans for his people. And Sister Sarah Sanders is going to be reading scripture for me today. So Sister Sarah, if you would.
As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions."
So God spoke to Abraham and told him his plans as far as his people are concerned, his chosen nation. And God also spoke to Jacob, his grandson, in a vision also about his plans in Genesis 46.
And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." "Here I am," he replied. "I am God, the God of your father," he said. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes."
So God told of Israel's impending mistreatment as slaves. Also, the fact that they would be delivered. And upon deliverance, they're going to have great possessions as they leave that land after their departure. He told Israel not to be afraid to go to Egypt. He would make them into a great nation, and that he would be with them and also bring them back. So God was intentional on his chosen nation, and God has a reason for everything. So let's just take a look at some of their journey. So after Joseph's family had come to Egypt, that's kind of where we left off last week, Pharaoh looked to accommodate them in the best part of the land. We know that the famine went on, and in order for them to survive, they needed food. And so they came to Egypt to get that. And of course, Joseph invited his entire family to come to Egypt. So we'll pick up in Genesis 47.
Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock."
So Pharaoh was so appreciative to Joseph and all that he had done for Egypt, because their very survival was attributed to the God given Joseph the vision, the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. So he allowed them to live in the best land. And so as we continue on in Genesis chapter 50, Sister Sarah.
Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
So Joseph is at the end of his life. And as he shared with them that God had made some promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to his people, and God will surely do what he promised. So we now we're going to fast forward in Exodus chapter 1.
Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them.
So all that knew Joseph loved him, and they appreciated him. They were kind not only to him, but his family, for his sake, his descendants. And so in Pharaoh's appreciation, of course, he had given their family some of the best land in Egypt. But of course, as years pass, things change. Exodus chapter 1.
Then came a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country.
So it's inferred by the king here that if care is not taken, they would to keep the Israelites under control, because as the scripture says, they became numerous. The king said, well, they're going to become dangerous to the government, and if war breaks out in our country, they would side with the enemies of Egypt and revolt from their allegiance to the crown of Egypt. So the king, he perceived the growing number of Hebrews to be a challenge to them as far as their control over Egypt. The proportion of Jews to Egyptians was uncomfortable. But if you think about it, there was no war to cause slavery. A lot of times, the conquering country enslaved the people that they conquered. But there was no war here. There was just fear. The majority enslaved the minority. So this situation, according to the king, called for a delicate balance. He needed to maintain the Israelite presence as an economic asset without jeopardizing Egypt's national security. So the Egyptians were threatened by the fact that the Hebrews had steadfastly resisted assimilation. The family structure of Israel remained intact. They hadn't been separated. They avoided intermarriage, and they really managed to maintain their distinctive identity. So the king said, let's deal with them wisely. He said that in verse 10, to act with skill, to make a shrewd plan. And of course, the king's shrewd plan was to enslave the Hebrews. So the Israelites became slaves due to fear, the insecurities of a country, not due to war or insurrection. They hadn't rose up against the government. It's a simple fact that the majority enslaved the minority. Well, why'd they do that? Well, because they could. They had the power to do it, and they wanted to maintain control, and they were afraid of losing their position if, in fact, they didn't control Israel. as God was blessing them with continued growth. So now we're in Exodus chapter 1, starting at verse 11, the king's plan.
So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with hard labor. And the sons of Israel built Pithom and Ramses as storage cities for the Pharaoh. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more they multiplied and expanded, so that the Egyptians dreaded and were exasperated by the Israelites. And the Egyptians made the Israelites serve rigorously, forcing them into severe slavery. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar, brick, and all kinds of field work. All their labor was harsh and severe.
So Egypt took care to keep them enslaved and poor. They charged them heavy taxes, which was a burden. The affliction was so great that their lives became bitter to them. Israel, their lives were bitter. Egypt tried to break their spirits, tried to ruin their health through slavery, shorten their lives, and diminish their number. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites because nothing they were doing to diminish the number was working. And so the king's plan, he wasn't working according to how he thought everything was going to pan out. So the Israelites were slave oppressed, but God was with them during their forced slavery. He told Israel that he would be with them through their bitterness, severe and harsh labor. So even through the worst time, God had told Israel that he would be with them, even during their worst time. So their population continued to grow in spite of the harsh conditions. Their harsh labor went on for years. It went on for years as they multiplied. It was decades later before the first order by the king to the midwives to kill Hebrew boys came. So 100 years or so had passed. And then we pick up in Exodus verse 16 in chapter 1.
When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God with profound reverence and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded, but they let the boy babies live.
So you can see that the presence of God was with the Hebrew women who were instructed by the king to kill male children. And so obviously when they were given a choice to obey the king or obey God, there really is no choice. Amen. There just really is no choice to obey the authorities of the country or to obey God. And then verse 20.
So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own.
Amen. So that was the first edict that the king had given the women, the midwives. Now, years later, the king gave a second order for population control, or should I say, for male population control. He gave a second order in Exodus 1 and 22.
Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born to the Hebrews must be thrown into the Nile, but every daughter you shall keep alive.
Of course, now at that point, then there's the birth of Moses, who God chose to lead his people out of Egypt. His father was from the tribe of Levi, his mother, a Levite woman. So let's continue in Exodus chapter 2.
One day, After Moses had grown into adulthood, it happened that he went to his countrymen and looked with compassion at their hard labors. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his countrymen. He turned to look around, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the next day and saw two Hebrew men fighting each other. And he said to their aggressor, "Why are you striking your friend?" But the man said, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Certainly this incident is known."
Moses objected to his own people being mistreated at the hands of the oppressor. But Moses also objected to his own people fighting one another as he tried to make peace between them. So here's my question: Why were slaves, the oppressed, fighting among themselves? Why was that going on? Anybody can help us out here. They're being oppressed at the hands of the oppressor, been in slavery hundreds of years. Why were they fighting amongst each other? Can anybody answer that for me?
Perhaps their frustration at the situation had boiled over.
Okay, frustration. Because being in slavery, you really don't have anything, right? You really don't have any rights. You really don't have much you can call your own. You serve at the whims of a master. But we find that to be true in countries that are being oppressed, that those who are oppressed tend to fight amongst each other. Remind you of anything? Is anything going on in this country?
Yes.
Well, hardly. That's because folks who are oppressed can't really rebel without severe tragedies happening. And so they bicker amongst themselves.
Okay. Brother the Bantons, you had a comment?
Yes, Brother Wynn. When I think of this situation, I look at the creation and the sins that are in us. And just like us, they had sins in them just the same. So there'd be envy, greed, all jealousies, all those things I think are some of the reasons why people would fight the same as we do now, whether it's oppressed or not. Those are some of the reasons why we take the wrong road and not look to God.
Okay, so those who are oppressed tend to fight amongst one another out of frustration, out of sin. Sometimes it's the crabs in the barrel syndrome that you can't get ahead because you're fighting each other. Nobody can get out the barrel as you fight amongst each other. As opposed to
Brother Wynn.
Yes.
Sometimes what you see is the only thing you know. And if the only way you see folks punished or corrected is through a brutal force, you tend to mimic that same behavior. It goes with kids who get abused at kids. When they grow up, they become abusers of their family. So living in this world, we start adapting or adopting some of the ways the world act.
Amen. And
Yeah.
keep that thought.
Brother Wynn.
Yes.
Brother Wynn, this is Brother Sanders. Yeah, I just want to echo on what Brother Williams said, because there was a study that was done looking at the riots in Detroit in the 1960s and stuff. And, the question was asked, why did Black people burn down their own neighborhoods in various communities? And to Brother Williams' comment is that sometimes the oppressed people act like the oppressor. And so when they see that the oppressor has this particular power and authority to be able to do things, the unconscious takes over and they mimic or mirror that behavior. And, it's therefore they start to oppress their own people. And, in the Black community, we know sometimes we oppress each other. And so it's a mirror behavior trying to survive, because if you can get the power, you can survive. And so it's like Brother William said, and then you see it also in families. If you have an abusive mother over their daughter, then that daughter is more likely to abuse her daughter when she gets older. And so, yeah, it's really deep. And it's more than just the proverbial crabs in a barrel that we talk about. It's a subconscious thing that Satan uses against us. So, yeah,
Okay.
Brother Williams, he hit it. So
what it ends up happening is the oppressed plays right into the hands of the oppressor,
Yes.
as now they have people fighting amongst themselves. So let's continue on in Exodus chapter 2.
When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well.
So Moses went to Midian, and of course we know that's where he met his wife and had his family. So about 15 years later, we'll pick up in chapter 2, verse 23. There we go.
During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them.
So now at last they begin to think of God under their trouble, under their burdens, and they cried out to God for help. My question is, why had they not cried out to God previously? What took them so long to cry, to moan and groan unto God and cry out to help? Anybody, what took them so long to do that? They've been walking in the sins of a country, hard labor, being burdened down, but the Bible says that they cried out to God in Exodus 2, verse 23 and 24, and God heard their cries. But what took them so long to cry out to him?
They missed too many church services.
and to that point, let's pick up what Ezekiel said in Ezekiel chapter 20.
And say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. On the day I choose Israel, I swore with uplifted hand to the descendants of Jacob and revealed myself to them in Egypt. With uplifted hand, I said to them, I am the Lord your God. On that day, I swore to them that I would bring them out of Egypt into a land I had searched out for them, a land flowing with milk and honey, the most beautiful of all lands. And I said to them, each of you get rid of the vile images you have set your eyes on, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. But they rebelled against me and would not listen to me. They did not get rid of the vile images they had set their eyes on, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. So I said I would pour out my wrath on them and spend my anger against them in Egypt. But for the sake of my name, I brought them out of Egypt. I did not keep my name from being profaned in the eyes of the nations among whom they lived, and in whose sight I had revealed myself to the Israelites.
So God had communicated with Israel to not serve the idols of Egypt, the oppressor, but they would not listen. So he allowed them to be subjected to their slavery longer with harsh, severe labor. as he was working, the reason he sent them to Egypt was to make them into a great nation through their adversity. Because that's what he had told Abraham, I'm going to send them there and they're going to be subject to some hard labor. But God was trying to get his chosen nation somewhere. He was trying to get them where he wanted them to be. So as the nation of Israel was walking in the sins of a country, being subject to slavery, forced labor, they also walked in Egypt's sin of idolatry. As Derek has said earlier, sometimes you take on the ways of the oppressor. So they had taken on the ways, the idol worship of the oppressor. So they fell victim so think about that. As they walked in the sins of a country, they fell victim to the country's sin. And of course, Egypt's sin was idol worship. So they allowed themselves to be their life to be swayed into doing what they saw. So I guess the point here is it's going to be critically important to maintain your freedom in Jesus, for us anyway, because Jesus says, if you abide in me, he would set us free. So we have to be very careful as we walk in if you're being oppressed, which people of color are being oppressed in this country, it's going to be critically important that we remain free and not allow the sins of the oppressor to sway us, as we see what happened to Israel here. So the groans of the oppressed cry loud to the ears of God, to whom vengeance belongs, especially the groans of God's spiritual Israel. He knows the burdens they groan under and also the blessings they groan after. They were subject to the sin of the oppressor, slavery, that people with power placed them under as a group of people. Now, this was done for their own benefits to maintain power. That's what Egypt was looking to do. Now there was an economic benefit for them because they had some free forced labor. It also gave them a sense of pride, Egypt. It gave them supremacy, a sense of pride over people as they were slave masters. But we can see clearly that God allowed this to take place as he was trying to get his chosen nation to a certain place in time with their faith to be obedient to him alone. So God allowed, he allowed them to go through some hard labor for a reason. And God had chosen Moses to lead his people out of the bondage of slavery. So as the Lord met with Moses in Exodus chapter 3, starting at verse 7, Sister Sarah.
And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cries because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. And now, therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now, therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt.
So the oppression, the misery, being kept in poverty to break them, Egypt burdened them down, to keep them down, to keep them under control through the sin of slavery. God was ready to deliver them. So in Exodus chapter 3, 16.
Go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you, and I have seen what has been done to you in Egypt.
The Lord was well aware of their plight of struggle, as he had told Jacob that he would be with them in Egypt. So God was with them the entire time. He was aware of the struggles they had, the plight that they had. And he was now ready to deliver them after their 400 years of oppression. And then we pick up in Exodus chapter 4.
Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped.
So Egypt had cried out to the Lord. Israel had cried out to him. He heard their cry. Moses told them everything that the Lord had said, that I've watched over you and I'm ready to deliver you from this. And now they bowed down and worshiped the Lord. And then in Exodus chapter 4, Sister Sarah.
Then Moses said to the Lord, please, Lord, I am not a man of words, eloquent and fluent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and tongue. The Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute or the deaf or the seeing or the blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now then go, and I, even I, will be with your mouth and will teach you what you shall say.
God knew of Moses' shortcomings regarding his speech, but he chose him anyway to be his instrument, despite any disadvantages that Moses had. But the interesting point here that I see, God said, listen, when Moses objected, God said, I made the mute. I made the deaf, the blind. And we know that God had his reasons for that, just like he had his reasons for Moses's speech issues. There was a reason for that. So God, our creator, is intentional, is what he's telling Moses. He intentionally, and we're going to talk about this on next week, God intentionally made the blind. We know that when Jesus healed the blind man, when the disciples said, well, Lord, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus said, what? He was born blind for such a time as this, that the power of God might be shown, as Jesus healed him. So my point is that the intentional God that we serve has his reasons for everything. He put you in a tent of color for a reason. He put me in a tent of color for a reason. He birthed, for 400 years, he birthed the Israelites into slavery intentionally for a reason. So I just want you to think about that, because we're going to talk about that on next week, God's intentionality and why he's so intentional. Because he's trying to get us all where he wants us to be, and that's part of his plan, and we'll talk about that. So even with their promised delivery from slavery, their plight got harder. As Moses was going to Pharaoh and petitioning Pharaoh to free his people, their plight got harder. And Exodus chapter 5 will pick up.
Then the slave drivers and the overseers went out and said to the people, this is what Pharaoh says, I will not give you any more straw. Go get your own straw wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all. Moses returned to the Lord and said, why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all.
So Moses obviously was concerned about God's timetable, but we know God has his own timetable. He acts according to his own will. And so we're going to Exodus chapter 6.
Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with many acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. Moses reported this to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and harsh labor.
So we can see that with the promise of freedom, the Israelites had some expectations, and they expected things to move according to their own timetable. If you're going to free us, we've been under this yoke of slavery a long time. Free us today, not next week. And of course, they became discouraged when Moses came and reported back to them again. They didn't listen to him because they were still dealing with harsher labor because of Moses's actions and Pharaoh. And we know that God had hardened the heart of Pharaoh as he was obstinate to removing or allowing Israel to be free. So he continued to refuse to let them to go after God had placed several plagues on the people. Now, after God had placed several plagues on the people and the land, the Lord had Moses say to Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 9,
but I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth.
So God had hardened the heart of Pharaoh for a reason. As he said, for this very purpose, that I might show my power, because Pharaoh, being king of Egypt, it was all about him. He had the power. The people thought he had the power, but God hardened his heart as he objected to all the plagues that have come on the land so far. And Pharaoh was like, well, I'm still in control. I still have the power. But Moses was telling that God says, I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show my power, that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So we pick up in Exodus chapter 11.
Now the Lord had said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. And when he does, he will drive you out completely. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by the people.
So let's go to Exodus chapter 12 as they're moving on out.
Brother Wynn.
Yes.
Yeah, this Brother Sanders. Real quickly before you move on, I mean, man, this is really deep. And when you look at the plight of Black people in America compared with this, there's a parallel. You know, the first slave that was delivered to this land was in 1619. And here we are in 2021. That was 400 years ago. The Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians for 400 years.
Yes, sir.
And then this Pharaoh rose up and, you know, had hardened his heart. And, you know, we had a Pharaoh who hardened his heart for, you know, this past 4 years. And now God is starting to work again in his people. Man, there's so many parallels between what we're reading now and what's going on with Black people. It's just amazing. And I just wanted to point that out, that we don't miss that. The other
Well,
part of this is that God delivered the Hebrews. He will deliver Black people just as well, but we got to remain in him. I mean, this is powerful, brother.
well, to your point, I'm covering Egypt this week. Next week, we're going to cover America. We're going to talk about the sins of a country, and not only the sins of a country, but also living in post-slavery. Because we're going to show some differences and parallels with Egypt here, how they had to deal with post-slavery compared to people of color, Black folks, dealing with post-slavery, after slavery had ended. How do you live? What's God's expectations? And so we're going to talk about that. So let's pick up in Exodus chapter 12.
The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Now, the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt, on this night, all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him.
So we can see that God had a plan for his chosen nation because he told Abraham what was going to happen. Is that right? He told them that they'd be enslaved for 400 years. But he also told them that when you leave the country, there's going to be some reparations. All right. As Sister Sarah read, that the articles of silver and gold and clothing were given to them. The Egyptians showed favor toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. And so as they exited slavery, as they left the country that had put them in forced labor, they left with some possessions. Now, also keep in mind that they had kept the nation intact. They didn't necessarily intermarry with the Egyptians. They had their traditions. Their family units were not broken up. They stayed intact, even though they were dealing with forced slavery. They were able to maintain the nation. And so when they left, God allowed for them to leave. And of course, they left as a nation, but he also took them to the promised land. So when we talk about post-slavery, Egypt moved to another country. God moved them to another country. So they weren't subjected any longer to the Egyptian power base, so to speak, because as we know that when Pharaoh changed his mind the last time and said, let's go get them back, that God drowned them in the sea. So there's definitely some parallels, but there's also some distinct differences. As here in America, we know that in post-slavery, it's not like we moved to another country and set up our own nation, but still living up under some oppression. So next week, when we talk, these are the scriptures for next week, because here's what we're going to talk about. It's a fact of life that people of color are still being oppressed in 2020, 400 years later, as Brother Sanders said. But what does God expect of us? How does he expect us to handle the sins of a nation, the sins of a country? We already know that we live in a fallen world, that God had promised sin in the garden sin. We dealing with that. We know that. We also know that we have to sometimes deal with the sins of other people, like Joseph did. We also know that we have to deal with our own sins. But we also know that in Jesus, he takes it away. But sometimes we're still objected to the sins of a country that we walk in every day. And how do you escape those? How do you deal with those? So I want everybody to be thinking about that, because we want to have some discussions on next week of the expectations that God has for Christians living under oppression.